every single DXer has had this happen at least once. You're sitting on a frequency and you've got a strong station dominating the landscape. Maybe you're on FM, maybe you're on AM, doesn't matter. Maybe it's a local, maybe it's just a really strong station, but you know there's another station there underneath. You just can't quite pull them out no matter what you do. Now, you can go out there and connect a couple of antennas to a phasing unit, and you can try to use that to help you get rid of the dominant station, or you can get all sorts of antennas on rotors like Yagis or loops or whatever. You can do a lot of different things, or you can get an Airspy HF Plus Discovery, a free copy of SDR Sharp software from Airspy, and just one antenna. And you can do the same thing to pull that DX out from underneath in the static and into your logbook. And today on DX101, we're going to teach you how. Stay tuned. Now, there are a number of different reasons, if they're not already, why most DXers should be using SDR software for their day-to-day DX pursuits. And I'm not going to get into all those right now. That's a whole separate video. But I am going to focus on one of the more important features that's out there tied to one particular piece of SDR software. The software is called SDR Sharp from the folks at Airspy, and the feature is called their AM and FM code channel canceller. What does that mean? What does it do? Well, it allows you to take a frequency where you have a dominant signal, and you can cancel that signal, wipe it out, gone. And what's left is the DX that was there underneath. You can do this live. You can also do this with recorded files as well. It's pretty magical that way. Now, one little disclaimer here before we get started. We're going to assume that you are using one of the SDRs that is supported by SDR Sharp software. Primarily, those are the Airspy product line, such as the HF Plus Discovery, the HF Plus Dual, the R2, the Mini, and so forth. You may have another SDR, and I know there are some sneaky ninja ways to kind of slice and dice and get an IQ file into SDR Sharp from an SDR that was not supported by the program. We're not talking about that. You're on your own there if you're trying that. We're just going to assume, because we're using in ours, an Airspy HF Plus Discovery. So we're going to assume that that's what you're using as a supported SDR of SDR Sharp software. And once you're in, we're going to show you how to use the code channel canceller, what it can do for you for AM and for FM, and how you can use it to get more DX into your logbook. Here we go. All right, we are here in SDR Sharp, and we are sitting on 600 kilohertz. And this is a file that I recorded this afternoon from here in Mandeville. And 600 kilohertz is where I have a local station here, WVOG in New Orleans. They're about 30 miles to my south across the lake, and they're pretty strong. But I've got some other stations underneath that I can hear, and so I've done that before with them either fading out or having dead air or using phasers and all that kind of other stuff. But today we're going to use one SDR, one piece of software, and one antenna, and we're going to get rid of WVOG. So first, let me just demonstrate how this works, and then I'll show you the settings you need to make sure that you have engaged to try to get it to work. So first, let us listen to WVOG. All right, there they are, nice and loud, music, tough to get through. Let's get rid of them. All right, that's pretty powerful stuff. We just took out, let me again remind you just how strong this local station is.
Pastor, the salvation of Lydia.
And we're going to get rid of it.
Information at the close.
And there's another station in there too that's probably Memphis, but we have KTBB in Tyler, Texas that's in there with a top of the hour ID. In the absence of WVOG. So we hit the canceller, get rid of them, and there's another station underneath. All right, so you ready to learn how to do this? Let's show you. It's super easy. There's just a couple of settings that you need to know. That's all. Again, one SDR, one antenna, and one piece of software. That's all you need, okay? Here we go. You'll probably have a little bit different layout than I do, but I want to make sure you at least know the 3 main boxes here, or kind of sections in SDR Sharp that you need to make sure that are open so that you can manipulate the settings. If you don't see any of these on your screen, you can always find them over here under the hamburger up in the top left-hand corner in SDR Sharp, and you'll be able to find them. Now, I'm running SDR Sharp version 1920. This is a release candidate. It's version 1920. You want to have this or later. I'll have a link to find version 1920 in the description below, but you may also want to find, look on the SDR Sharp download page. I'll also have that link down below, and see if there's a more recent version than version 1920. But this is the version that I'm working on. Anything before this, the canceller is a little different, and it behaves a little bit differently. So you want to make sure you at least have version 1920 or later. Okay, so we're going to start with that. Okay, so let me show you the main ones you want to make sure that you have engaged here. Number one is the radio. This is where you have your modes and things like that. This is the option right here to see it if you don't see it on your screen. And this is where I have it docked over here. So we're going to be looking at this tab right here called radio. Another one that you're going to make sure that you have is right here. It is called Micro Tuner, FFT Micro Tuner. I have it docked here at the bottom of my screen. It's probably the easiest place to kind of work with it. And so you'll want to have it up and available and have the little checkbox right here that says Micro Tuner checked and engaged. Okay. And the final one that you want to have is your code channel canceller. Now we're going to be starting with AM, so we're going to focus on that first, but you can also obviously have the FM open. I keep mine separate because I do both, and so I don't want to have to toggle back and forth between the two using a little tab system like I do in my noise reduction. I keep both open separately, but you can do that. You can stack them on top of each other and tab between the two if you want to do that. That's totally fine to save space. Whatever works best for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here on each box and what you need to know about those boxes to make this magical thing work. Okay, number one, let's start with radio. You have to be in DSB mode. It's not going to work in AM. It's not going to work in lower or upper sideband. You have to be, for the AM code channel canceller, you have to be in DSB. That's the only way this works. Okay. So if you're not in one of those, if you're not getting any success, if it's not working for you, double check your mode, because sometimes I'll be in upper sideband and I'll forget I'm still in upper sideband or lower sideband. I have to go check and make sure I'm in double sideband here, dual sideband, DSB. The next thing here is the bandwidth. Now I talk about this because I think most of the times when I've seen people have issues with the code channel canceller, this is what I've seen as one of the reasons they're not having success. Now, this is not official. This is not any of the documentation that's out there. This is my interpretation of what I think is happening based on how I've seen this code channel canceller work. Okay, so stay with me. What the code channel canceller is basically doing is you're zeroing in on a carrier, and it's basically trying to get rid of that carrier and any audio or whatever that's kind of attached to it, right? So there's software code and algorithms and whatever else that the Airspy folks have put into this that's doing that behind the scenes. And then what's left is kind of what it knows is what's left over on that frequency based on the data that it's gathered, the ones and zeros of the digital data that it's gathered. In order for it to have a shot to fully get rid of that signal, your bandwidth needs to be able to encapsulate all of that data, okay? If your bandwidth is too narrow, there's going to be data off to the sides of that carrier, off outside of your bandwidth, that are still kind of seeping through. Think of it like a funnel, right? So if you have a lot of water that you're pouring in through a funnel into a container, if you have a bunch of water, you need a big wide funnel to make sure you get all that in there. If it's just a tiny little stream, you can get by with a smaller funnel. But if it's a big wide, you're coming out of like a fire hose, you're going to need a pretty big funnel to get all that into your container. Otherwise, it's going to spill out the sides of the funnel and you're not going to get all of it in the container, right? Kind of the premise we're talking about here. I usually start with my bandwidth here at about 8,000. That's pretty close to what I think is kind of the optimal. Now, you can narrow it down within the code channel canceller functions itself if you need to for very specific reasons. But 99% of the time, most of us are going to be somewhere within that 8,000 range is probably pretty good. Okay. That allows you to have most of that data coming from your signal encapsulated within that bandwidth. And so it's trying to look now within that bandwidth to get rid of all that data and cancel it out using the software code. If you have a super wide signal. Let's say you're sitting next to a transmitter, a 50,000 kilowatt station, okay? I've got WWL to my south. I sometimes will need to widen my bandwidth a little bit more to encapsulate more of that data to give that code channel canceller a better shot at getting rid of it. So if it's a super wide signal, you might have to go a little bit wider, but at least kind of somewhere in that 8,000 range is where I usually would start, okay? That should be fine. The next setting here is lock carrier. You have to make sure that lock carrier is engaged right here. Otherwise, it ain't gonna work, okay? You have to have a lock carrier engaged. Now, these other settings in here, binaural mode, anti-fading, sticky lock, those are not required for the canceller, but I use them for various different ways to manipulate the audio that I get outside of the canceller, right? So I've hit the canceller, I've gotten rid of WVOG. Let's say the audio is not super great. I might start kind of tweaking these a little bit, maybe turning off binaural mode or something like that and seeing how that affects the signal. So click around a little bit, but just make sure don't unclick the lock carrier, because if you unclick lock carrier, it's going to go away and you're going to be able to have your signal back in. So lock carrier needs to be engaged. DSB needs to be engaged, and your bandwidth needs to be wide enough to encapsulate all of that data from the signal that you're trying to get rid of. Those are the three most important things on the radio tab. So now let's look at the microtuner. You do need to have this little microtuner doodad right here, this little checkbox checked. And other than that, that's really about it. For settings, this is where you're actually telling the software what signal do you want to get rid of. Now, I've got a nice big peak right here. This is my strongest signal. This is WVOG. So you see that red line right there? That red line right there is my signal from WVOG, the peak of it. So I'm telling the microtuner, I'm telling the software, get rid of that guy and anything attached to it, okay? There are other peaks here. There's a little one right here. There's a little one right here. There's a little guy right here, and then so forth. So where the code channel canceller works the best is when you have a kind of a dominant station that you can get rid of, and then kind of a clear path behind that you can kind of sort through, just like we have here with WVOG. One dominant station, get rid of them. What do we have left, right? If you don't have a dominant station, let's just say that this peak right here, instead of being kind of up here, was a little bit flatter, right? Kind of like some of these over here, and it was kind of even with a lot of these. You're maybe not going to have as much success in that scenario, because basically everything is really flat. It's a little bit harder for that software to have anything to kind of grab a hold of and get rid of, so you might not get as good of results if it's kind of a mush. That's not to say, I mean, there are times where I'll have 3 or 4 or 5 peaks on my microtuner, and I'll kind of click between those and get rid of different stations and see what kind of gives me the best look. Like, as an example, let's just say WVOG was doing some religious talk, and there was a station underneath them with music that was really kind of making it hard for me to hear anything underneath them. I'm okay with WVOG because they're talking, there's pauses and things like that, but I want to get rid of the music. So I get rid of them, and then I can hear the other stuff underneath. So that's why sometimes you can kind of click around, but you definitely need to have some peaks above that overall average line right here. Your overall noise level, right? You need to have some peaks above that to really have anything to work with. If it was really, really flat, it's going to be tough, and you might not get great results. Sometimes you do. Sometimes it's just above enough to be able to grab a hold of it, but sometimes it's too tricky. So play around with it, try it out, and see what your results are. But no, if you're not getting results and you look and you see it's really flat, that's probably why. Okay? If everything else you've done is kind of following what we're talking about, that's a good indication of probably what's going on. All right, so that's really the microtuner. It's just finding that signal peak that you want to get rid of, and maybe it's the strongest one, maybe it's not, but you just want to zero in with one click on that signal. Boop right there, boop right there, boop right there. Now, I do want to show you one thing before we do move on from the microtuner. You'll see here, I've got that kind of squared in the middle of that peak. That's where you want to be. If you're off to the side a little bit, even just a little, let me show you what happens here. So I'm going to go back to my signal.
We went out of the city by
now I'm going to engage the code channel canceller.
where prayer was wont to be made. And we sat down.
Now it's still in there. It's weak, and I've gotten rid of most of it, but it's still in there just a little bit, and that's because I'm not really centered in directly on my peak. That's where you want to be. Because again, with your bandwidth and everything else, you want to say that's the middle point here. Get rid of everything off to the side of it. So if your pointer is off to the one side or another, you might be leaving off some of that stuff off to the side that's still getting through. Maybe it's not a lot, but if you want to get rid of it like we have been, you want that middle. Turn my canceller off. Hit my audio. Now I turn it back on. They're gone. The best results will be when you get that dead center in the middle of the peak that you're trying to get rid of. Okay. And so now let's look at our co-channel canceller. So obviously there's a couple of settings here. The most important being turning it on or off. Your toggle switch, that's pretty necessary and self-explanatory too. Remove carrier, another one that should make sense. You have to have that on. If you don't have that on, you're not removing anything. Okay. So you want to make sure you have your remove carrier check on. Okay. Auto tune is basically, it's going to go try to get rid of that strongest peak, and that's fine. Two things about that. One, you may not be wanting to get rid of the strongest peak. Maybe you are. Most times we are probably, but there may be scenarios where you're wanting to get rid of another one. Or maybe it's having a hard time locking in. Like if you have it on auto tune, sometimes you'll hear it kind of like fluttering in, like little like just kind of comes back. That strong stem kind of comes back in a little bit. Maybe that carrier is kind of drifting a little bit, or maybe it's just having a hard time keeping a lock on that. That's where I will sometimes turn that off. A lot of times I have that turned off, and I'm just kind of manually doing that myself, and I seem to have pretty good results with that. So if the auto tune, if you're kind of struggling with that, it's not really keeping that signal out, try turning it off and just clicking on your peak and kind of going from there, because that should keep most. If you're kind of centered in that peak, if you start to see it's kind of getting off to the side a little bit, you can recenter it. That's easy. But if it's centered like that, it should get rid of most of it. Okay. Sometimes that auto tune, if there's like a couple of signals competing, it might try to drift over between them, and that can cause some funkiness in there. So I tend to like to have control over. I'm a control freak when it comes to my DX, so that's probably why, but I tend to like to have control over which signal it's getting rid of. Carrier offset. Generally speaking, I don't use this a lot because I don't do a lot of transoceanic DX. But let's say I do. Let's say I'm on one of the coasts and I'm wanting to hear something across the ocean. And let's say I'm in Maine and I'm on a 10 kilohertz frequency, but I want to hear that frequency from Algeria that's on a 9. So I'm on 890. I've got Algeria 891 coming in. I want to tune in 891. I want to get rid of the stuff on 890 that's super strong. You can set your carrier offset to do that. So basically, I go up to 891, I set my carrier offset to a -1000, and that in theory should get rid of the carrier, the strong carrier there on 890 that's causing me interference, and hopefully leave me the stuff on 891. Now, it's not, you can't get super far off with this. So I would say probably 1, maybe 2 kilohertz, I think is what I've seen is the best. Probably 1 is probably the best. Anything more, much more than that, I've not seen great results. But some of you may have different stories about that, and that's cool. But like if you're on 1090 or 1089, you want to hear 1090, or 1090, you want to hear 1089. Those that are about 1K off from each other, that seems to be kind of the sweet spot for the carrier offset. Much more than that. So if you're on 891 and you want to get rid of 890, it's below where you are, you want to use the negative number. If you're on 1089, you want to get rid of 1090, it's above where you are, you're not going to use the negative number, use your positive, just a regular positive number. That's what the carrier offset's for. But again, I don't do a lot of that because I don't do a lot of transoceanic here from Louisiana, so there may be some other videos that you can find that might go into more detail about both that and the IF offset. I've not really played with either one of those a whole lot. I did the carrier offset a little bit when I was in Charleston for that purpose, to get some of those transatlantics, but I haven't played with it much in the most recent iteration. So, but you can try those out. Definitely give it a shot and see if it does what you need to do. I did use it recently for Algeria, and it worked fine. Bandwidth, this is going to be set to whatever your receiver bandwidth is over here in the radio tab, but you can go in here and narrow that down. And it won't adjust your receiver bandwidth. It's just the bandwidth for the co-channel canceller. Now, why would you need to do that? Well, there's not a lot of situations. So I don't really touch this setting very often. If I do, let's say I'm on 600, and let's say there's a station on 600.1 or .2 or .3, and on 599.8 or 599.9 or whatever. And it's kind of close by. It's having a hard time. And those stations are within my bandwidth. It's having a hard time kind of getting rid of all those. So I can tighten in my bandwidth closer into my receive frequency here so that those are now outside of my bandwidth. And so if I don't have a really big wide signal in here I'm trying to get rid of, but I've got some offsets kind of on either side or one side or another, I can tighten up my bandwidth, and that will help me in the software be able to get rid of the signal I want to get rid of a little bit easier. Okay. Again, I don't use this very often, but it can help in those very specific kind of situations. The setting you will use on the regular, though, is the correction. That is the amount of calculations you're telling the software to basically do to get rid of what you need to get rid of. So you want to use as little as you possibly can. The more you use, the more fluttery and watery the audio is going to sound, because you're really kind of just cramming it all in there and letting the software just go to town. You don't need a whole lot in most cases. And 90% of the time I've found something between 5 and 10 is exactly where you need to be, okay? For your average strong signal, you got a good strong signal in there. Sometimes I can back it off even more if I have a little bit less of a strong signal. If I'm trying to get rid of WWL, maybe I'm all the way maxed out and that's still not doing the trick. But yeah, somewhere in that 5 to 10 range is usually, and you can see here we're right around 7 or 8 or so. That's usually the sweet spot, somewhere in there. Most of the time it's right around 5. So you'll want to play with that a little bit. If it's really super fluttery, super watery sounding, back it off a little bit until you start hearing that signal you're trying to get rid of come back in, and kind of nudge it back up a little bit more and kind of find the sweet spot somewhere right in the middle between those two spots of fluttery and, you know, the audio from the unwanted signal is coming in. Somewhere between there is where you want your number to be. Okay. So back it off as much as you can and kind of just nudge it up until you get rid of the signal that you don't want. If I still have some fluttery audio, or let's say I want to kind of clean it up a little bit, I might engage some noise reduction here, either audio or IF, depending on what kind of works better. I might kind of bounce back and forth between the two to see which one gives me better results. But you can use that. And again, it's the same kind of premise. I start low down here on my slider, my threshold, and I'll kind of rise it up until I get to that point where now I'm like, okay, now it's making enough of a difference, but it's not too much, because if it's too much, it's going to sound like water, right? So I don't want to put too much noise reduction in there. I just want to put just enough to help maybe some speech, IDs, things like that kind of stand out from the rest of the stuff going on. It's basically getting rid of some of that headroom of static and things like that, cleans it up a little bit, and gives you a little bit better presentation to try to pull out some detail from some spoken word. That's what I usually use it for when I'm using my co-channel canceller, or even just in general DX, okay? So I might engage a little bit of noise reduction, but usually just the co-channel canceller, like we just saw with the BVOG, usually on its own, that's enough to get rid of what I need to get rid of and move on. So that's the AM co-channel canceller. You got 3 main areas you need to contend with: your radio being on DSB, your bandwidth to make sure it's wide enough to encapsulate your signal you're trying to get rid of, and lock carrier. And then your micro tuner to pick your carrier peak that you want to get rid of, your co-channel canceller to turn it on, and adjust your correction. That's it. That's the co-channel canceller for AM in a nutshell. There's also one for FM. Now, I don't have a lot of great conditions right now to demonstrate this, so I do have this on a recording that I did recently from a Tropo opening here in Mandeville, where I have a local station on 98.1, the Eagle in Baton Rouge, semi-local we'll call it. And when I engaged the co-channel canceller during this opening, I had 2 other stations. There was a country station and another station underneath them with a female talking. So I think at the time it was Texas and Florida were coming in. So, you know, let's say it's an E-skip opening or a Tropo opening, and you've got, like in my case, I've got a little bit of Texas, I got a little bit of Florida. I'm getting both sides of this. Right now, the Texas is the strong one on this one frequency. I want to get rid of them because I've already got them, and want to hear the Florida station on the other side. That's where I would use the co-channel canceller, right? So watch what happens when we engage it here. There's really only one setting here, 2 settings: turning it on and adjusting your sensitivity, which is kind of like the correction scale. That's about it. You're not really touching anything else on this co-channel canceller for FM.
Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Eagle981FM.
That's it. I mean, that was it. Watch it one more time. Once we engage that co-channel canceller, the Eagle goes away. Now there's a little bit of the guitar. I think it was probably Cat Scratch Fever or something like that they were playing. There's a little bit of that guitar still in there from 98.1 the Eagle. I could have probably adjusted my sensitivity a bit more to kind of get rid of them. But then if you do that too much, that's when things kind of get a little wonky. So I only put in as much as I need to. That was plenty clear enough, even with a little bit of that signal still in there. That was still plenty clear enough for me to be able to hear what was underneath and probably get an idea out of them if I had stuck around for a bit. So one more time.
1 FM.
That's it. Country station and a talk station, probably religious or something like that station underneath, and that was it. Done. So hopefully this has helped you see exactly what the code channel canceller can do. Just gone. Get rid of it. I want it out of the way so I can get the DX underneath it. That's what this is about. One SDR, one antenna, one piece of software. That's all you need. You don't have to have a big expansive setup, and you don't have to have knobs that you're turning over here and all this other kind of no off-board software with virtual cables or any of that kind of stuff, routing things all different places. No. We got one piece of software, one SDR, and one antenna, and a couple of buttons that you need to make sure you toggle, and that's it. And you can get those kinds of results. We have 2 stations on FM that we heard there, and we had at least 1, if not 2, on the AM side underneath my local station. So that's the kind of results you can expect in most cases. Now, your mileage may vary, as always. Sometimes it's going to be there, sometimes it's not. But at least now you know the basics that you need to have in place to kind of get that code channel canceller going. And I promise you, if you're diligent with it and you practice and you keep working at it, eventually you're going to nab one that you wouldn't have gotten, right? Hopefully this video has been helpful for you. So if so, we would appreciate it if you hit the like button and leave us a comment. That really helps us out here. And don't forget to also subscribe and hit the bell icon so be notified when new videos are available. From all of us here at DX Central, my friends, thank you so much for watching. Take care. Best of DX and 73.